Now, let's look at what happens to the supply curve when the things we assumed to be constant are allowed to change. When one of the things we assume were constants is allowed to change, the supply curve and the supply schedule will change their values. First, let's look at the supply schedule. In the table, there are 3 columns. In the first column, we have prices associated with different quantities of the good being supplied. In the second column, we have a starting quantity supplied, or the quantity supplied before one of the variables changes. The third column represents the quantity supplied after the change in the variable. The table shows that at a price of $1 before an increase in the price of an input, firms are willing and able to offer 10 units of the good. However, after the price of the input to the good being supplied decreases, the firms are willing and able to offer 20 units of the good for $1. The reason that the firms were willing and able to supply more of the good after the price of the input decreased is that the cost of producing the good has declined, and firms have passed the savings on to customers to increase their profits by selling more of the good. We could move down to the next price and observe that before the price of the input decreased, firms were willing to able to offer 20 units at $2, and after the price decrease, they were willing to offer 30 units of the good. Now, let's look at what happens to the supply of books. Suppose that the price of paper decreases, which is used to make books. The result is that the whole supply curve for books shifts or moves over to the right. Let's take a minute to see why this shift happens. If we graph all the prices and all the quantities of books before the price of the paper decreases, we would get the supply curve S0. And if we were to graph the prices and quantities of books after the price of paper decreases, we would get the supply curve S1. There are 2 things to note about this graph. First, the entire curve line shifts or moves over to a new position to the right because the supply of books at every price has increased. Second, supply curves are given names using the letter S with a subscripted number. The subscripted number represents how old or how recent the supply curves are. Lower numbers represent older supply curves and higher numbers represent newer supply curves. Thus, in the graph depicted above, S0 is older than S1. Indeed, S0 represents the original supply curve and S1 represents the newer supply curve, which is the result of a decrease in the price of paper. The graph on this slide shows that the quantity supplied at $3 as a result of a decrease in the price of paper. Notice on the supply curve S0, the quantity demand is 30 books. This is labeled Q0. After the shift in demand to the right, the quantity demanded is 40 books, and this is labeled Q1. Like with naming supply curves, quantities are labeled using numbers to indicate how old or how recent the quantity is on the graph. So Q0 is the original quantity and Q1 is the quantity after the shift takes place. Now let's include a demand curve in our diagram with a shift in supply. Notice, like the supply curve, demand curves is given a name. Demand curves are named using D and a number. The smaller the number, the older the demand curve is. Traditionally, the first demand curve is given the name D0. Here's an example of how an economist would like to do supply shift analysis. The first and most obvious difference between this example of a supply shift and a supply shift on the previous screen is the lack of numbers on the price, the up and down or vertical axis, and the quantity back and forth or horizontal axis. However, if you remember, as your eye moves up from the bottom of the graph, the price increases, and as your eye moves from left to right, the quantity increases. The supply curve S0 crosses the demand curve D0 at an equilibrium point E0. Drawing a line straight down from E0 to the quantity axis gives the equilibrium quantity of Q0, and drawing a line from the equilibrium point E0 to the price axis gives the equilibrium price P0. Next, the supply curve shifts to the right, and as a result of the shift, a new equilibrium, E1, is created. Drawing a line straight down from E1 to the quantity axis gives a new equilibrium quantity, Q1. And drawing a line from the new equilibrium point E1 to the price axis gives a new equilibrium price P1. Since Q1 is further to the right than Q2 on the quantity axis, this means that Q1 is larger than Q0, and as a result, the economist will conclude that the quantity of books has increased. Since P1 is lower than P0 on the price axis, this means that P1 is smaller than P0. And as a result, the economist would conclude that the price of books has decreased. Let's look at another example of a supply curve. Now let's include a demand curve with our diagram with a shift to the left in the supply curve. Notice, like the supply curve, the demand curve is given a name. Demand curves are named using a D and a number. The smaller the number, the older the demand curve is. Traditionally, the first demand curve is given the name D0. Once the shift has taken place, we may observe what happens to the amount of good that is being supplied. In particular, there are three things of interest to us. First, what happens to the equilibrium point. Second, what happens to the equilibrium price. Third, what happens to the equilibrium quantity. Let's look what happens when there's a shift in the supply curve to the left. The place where the original supply curve S0 crosses the original and only demand curve D0. The crossing of S0 and D0 creates an equilibrium point E0. Remember that equilibrium points are often given a name using the letter E and a number indicating how old or how recent the equilibrium point is. The equilibrium quantity is 30 books, Q0, and the equilibrium price is $2.30, P0. Next, the price of paper increases. The increase in the price of paper triggers the firm's supply curves to shift to the left from S0 to S1. S1 crosses the demand curve at a new point or meeting place, creating a new equilibrium point called E1. Once again, the 1 in the name tells you that this equilibrium point is more recent than E0. If we draw a line down from the equilibrium point E1 to the quantity axis, there is a new equilibrium quantity associated with the equilibrium point E1 of 22 books and is called Q1. If we draw a line to the left of the equilibrium point E1 to the price axis, there is a new equilibrium price associated with E1 of $3.30. This is called P1. Notice that Q1 is closer to the origin on the quantity axis, which has a value of 22 books, and is less than Q0. So the quantity of books available has decreased as a result of the shift of the supply curve. The quantity has decreased from Q0 to Q1. Also notice that the P1 is higher on the price axis and it has a value of $3.30. This is higher than P0 or $2.30. So the price of an individual book has increased as a result of the shift of the supply curve. The price has increased from increased from P0 to P1. Here's an example of how economists like to do leftward shift supply analysis. The most obvious difference between this example of a supply shift and the supply shift on the previous slide is the lack of numbers on the price axis and on the quantity axis. However, as you may remember, as your eye moves up from the bottom of the screen, price increases, and as your eye moves from left to right, the quantity increases. The supply curve F0 crosses the demand curve D0 at an equilibrium point E0. Drawing a straight line from E0 to the quantity axis gives the equilibrium quantity. Drawing a line from the equilibrium point to the price axis gives the equilibrium price P0. Now, the supply curve shifts to the left, creating a new equilibrium point called E1. Drawing a line straight down from E1 to the quantity axis gives a new equilibrium quantity Q1. And drawing a line from the equilibrium point E1 to the price axis gives a new equilibrium price P1. Since Q1 is to the left of Q0 on the price axis, this means that Q1 is smaller than Q0. As a result, the economists would conclude that the quantity of books being supplied has decreased. Since P1 is higher than P0 on the price axis, this means that P1 is greater than P0. As a result, the economists would conclude that the price of books has increased. Supply curves will shift in response to changes in a number of variables. These include the prices of resources or inputs used in the production of goods, technology and productivity, expectations about the future, the number of sellers or producers, and finally, exchange rates. Increases in the prices of resources used to manufacture a product will cause the supply curve for that good to shift to the left. A tax on the production of goods will cause the supply curve to shift to the left as well. Thus, an increase in taxes on producers' goods is really an increase in costs. Appreciation of a currency will cause domestic goods to cost more to produce relative to their foreign counterparts. Decreases in the prices of resources used to manufacture a product will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. A subsidy is a payment by government to a business to help the business cover the cost of producing a good. A subsidy to a business will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. Depreciation of a currency will cause domestic goods to cost less in foreign markets, and so it will cause the supply curve for domestic goods sold in foreign markets to the right. The graph above illustrates the impact of an increase in the price of paper used to manufacture books. The supply curve S0 represents the supply of books before the increase in the price of paper. The equilibrium quantity Q0 and P0 represent the equilibrium quantity and price. When the price of paper increases, the cost of publishing a book increases. Publishers respond by reducing the quantity of books they offer for sale. As a result of the decrease in the amount of books offered for sale, the supply curve will shift to the left. In the example in the diagram above, the supply curve will shift from S0 to S1. The shift from S0 to S1 will cause the equilibrium price to increase from P0 to P1 and the equilibrium quantity to decrease from Q0 to Q1. Another factor which causes supply curves to shift is technology and by extension productivity. Productivity is the measure of the amount of product made by a worker. In general, economists see technology as a way to enhance worker productivity. As a result, the adoption of new technology will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. If a firm returns to an older method or technology or fails to adopt a new technology, the supply curve for the firm will shift to the left. In general, increases in productivity will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. Decreases in productivity cause the supply curve to shift to the left. In the diagram above, the supply curve S0 represents the amount of goods supplied before the firm introduces a new machine. After the firm installs the new technology, the workers become more productive and the supply of cars produced by workers shifts to the right to supply curve S1. Notice as a result of the shift to the right of the supply curve that the equilibrium price decreases from P0 to P1 and the equilibrium quantity increases from Q0 to Q1. Supply will also be influenced by the number of firms in the market willing and able to offer the good. An increase in the number of sellers will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. A decrease in the number of sellers will cause the supply curve to shift to the left. In this graph, the supply curve S0 represents the supply curve before new suppliers enter the market for cars. After the new suppliers enter the market, the amount of cars will increase because firms are supplying more of them. As a result of the shift to the right of the supply curve for cars, the equilibrium price decreases from P0 to P1 and the equilibrium quantity will increase from Q0 to Q1.